Good day, and welcome to Ballots and Bagels, Conversations with Trusted Election Sources, a series from the German Marshall Fund's Alliance for Securing Democracy, where we discuss the security of U.S. elections in the lead up to the 2022 midterms with people who help protect them. My name is David Levine, and I'm the Elections Integrity Fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy and your host. Today's interview, for today's fifth episode, I'd like to welcome longtime Wisconsin election administrator and attorney Mike Haas, who now serves as city attorney for Madison, Wisconsin, to discuss Wisconsin's August 9th primary and Wisconsin elections more broadly. Haas was selected as Madison's city attorney in May 2020. He worked for many years as a private attorney and as a municipal attorney, working with elected officials on a regular basis. He later worked as a staff counsel and elections division administrator at the Government Accountability Board, the GAB, before becoming interim administrator at the Wisconsin Elections Commission. He has handled legal and administrative issues related to the 2012 recall election, the 2016 presidential and general election cycle, and successful completion of the nation's only statewide recount of 2016's presidential contest. He is an expert in election security, has testified in Congress on the topic and authored numerous articles and papers related to election law. And in short, he knows a thing or two about elections. Despite all of the challenges, Wisconsin appears to have carried out a pretty successful August 9th primary. And I look forward to discussing this and more with Madison City Attorney Mike Haas. Mike, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, David. Good to be with you.
Likewise. Well, let's jump right in. Many election officials I've spoken with have noted the sharp contrast between administering elections now and before the 2020 cycle, including a rise in harassment, abuse, and threats made against them and their colleagues. And this has contributed to many election officials, frankly, leaving the field. In response to similar concerns, the Madison City Council recently approved a new rule, unanimously, I believe, that would create a new penalty for disorderly conduct targeting election officials. A rule you thought would, and I quote, increase accountability for those who harass or threaten local election officials simply because of their job. Can you tell our listeners a bit about your initial motivation for working in elections and how the conduct of elections in Wisconsin has evolved since you began working in the field, both from an administrative and a political perspective?
Sure. I can try. It's interesting. As you know, a lot of us are sort of accidental election officials. And I remember sitting in a meeting when I first joined the Government Accountability Board, a staff meeting of about 30 people, and thinking, how did all these people get here? We don't go to college to learn how to run elections. Fortunately, there's more and more educational programs to help train folks on sort of the basics of election officials. As you mentioned, I was a private attorney and represented 3 small municipalities, and so was a little bit involved in elections and ethics and campaign finance. But when the Government Accountability Board started up in 2008, they were recruiting for a couple of staff attorneys, and I was looking for a new opportunity and started there. So I've been really heavily involved in elections since 2008. Wisconsin, of course, has just been a hotbed, not only over the last few years, but over the last decade and a half, with being a battleground state and our state, just our sort of election, I don't know if trauma is the right word, but since 2010, 2011, we've had statewide recounts, 2 statewide recounts. We've had recall elections of the governor. We've had early in 2011, of course, we had sort of massive protests at the state capitol, resulting in all kinds of complaints that our agency had to process. And so I think as we got headed into 2016, we had a new election agency, the Wisconsin Elections Commission. The legislature had abolished the Government Accountability Board, essentially because it did not like the fact that we had participated in a campaign finance investigation involving the governor's campaign. So we had a brand new agency in 2016. And so I was appointed as the first administrator of the Elections Commission. And as we got into the fall, of course, then that's when concerns came to light about foreign interference in elections. And so we spent, most of the next 4 years focusing on foreign interference and cybersecurity and how to combat that. And then, little did we know that headed into the next elections, the main threat would actually be more disinformation and misinformation from candidates and elected officials. And as you know, elected officials have to constantly evolve and become masters at different disciplines. And we had to become more proficient at being proactive about getting the facts out to folks ahead of time.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point you raise. And in fact, I seem to recall in a previous podcast, you had touched on the fact that, there were a lot of people calling out what's going on in Ukraine, right, from Russia. But that there seemed to be a bit of a cognitive disconnect between how we were talking about disinformation and dealing with it in the foreign context versus how we were dealing with in the domestic context. I'm hoping you can talk to us, a little bit more, particularly with regards to how that's affected election officials.
Yeah, it's been very unfortunate. As you mentioned, we in the city of Madison recently passed an ordinance to try to address this. But after the 2016 election, our state and local election officials have just been subjected to, unfortunately, constant amount of harassment, threats over the phone, online, in person, at the grocery store, in their communities. I know my former colleagues at the State Elections Commission that have just had to deal with really nasty phone calls demanding their home address, and talking about their families and requiring security when they're not at work, and at the local level. Madison is always a big target. It's second largest city, of course. It is tended to be, seen as on the more liberal side. But the state of Wisconsin, like a lot of states now, has a kind of a rural-urban divide in its politics. And we have a legislature that is dominated by the Republican Party. And frankly, that legislature tends to be concerned about the city of Madison when the city of Madison tries to innovate in anything, including elections. And we saw that in the 2020 election as well. And so, I have colleagues at the state and local level who have just become frustrated, in addition to sort of the burnout due to the constant administrative challenges, legal changes, litigation. They're now taking it on personally. And as you know, across the country, election officials are leaving the field. And this is a time when we need them most, the experienced election officials who have been through the fires and survived and have wisdom about how to handle it. So we tried to take a small step at the city of Madison, both to signal that harassment of election officials is not going to be tolerated, and to provide support to the election officials, our clerk staff, and the poll workers, to know that the city has their back. Essentially, what we did is increase the penalty for disorderly conduct if it is targeted at an election official. And that it's only a city ordinance, but hopefully it will fend off that behavior when it's lower level before it becomes a criminal offense.
I appreciate the practical, the way in which you talk about this, the recognition of the potential limitations that may exist in terms of what the state legislature may be doing to help you, and what you're trying to do at the local level to perhaps fill the gap. To your point, right, the fight over integrity of elections in Madison is fierce. Madison's been in the middle of much of it. I mean, I know that your clerk, I think it's Maribeth Weitzel-Beal, and her staff have received death threats, as I understand, investigated by the FBI. And I know, if I've got this correctly, when former Supreme Court Justice Michael Gableman wouldn't agree to question the Madison mayor publicly about his probe into the 2020 election, if I have this correctly, he threatened to jail the mayor. Something I just can't sort of wrap my head around. And of course, I know that during the legislative session, legislators put forward a number of bills to give them, in essence, more power of elections and put more obstacles in the way through the process. I'm hoping you can walk through a little bit more some of the challenges that folks that Wisconsin election officials have faced with regards to threats and harassment a little more concretely, as well as what you and others are trying to do. You mentioned the ordinance. I don't know how much insight you may have, for example, with regards to the Dane County Election Task Force that I know recently came out with a report. But, I think it's important that folks have a sense, even in challenging times, of perhaps, what things they may be able to do to try and move the needle.
Dane County recently put together a task force that looked at security of elections and voting equipment and came up with a series of recommendations. We work closely with the county. We're housed in the same building and with the county clerk. And I know that the county clerk has some both short-term and long-term plans. So when I started here at the city, we tried to bring a few things that worked at the state level to the city. For instance, after the 2016 elections, as you probably know, and the kind of the threats towards cybersecurity, there was a lot of training that was done to help election officials deal with that. And so we ended up at the state level using tabletop exercises. And this, of course, was really pioneered by the Balfour Center. And at the state level, we brought together clerks from all over the state, and we would go through an election day in like 3 hours. There was a clock there that showed the moving time, and we would throw scenarios at them and get them to respond in real time, throw curveballs at them, focus on really three things. What was the reaction going to be? Who is going to take the lead? And then looking at communications, both internal communications and communications to the public. And we thought that was a really good exercise just to get the sort of the mental muscles exercised about people responding in real time. We brought that to the local level, a little bit scaled back process where we got together with law enforcement, the city, the county, state cybersecurity officials, the FBI, and we just, again, ran through a number of scenarios. It was not as elaborate, but it was just to make sure everybody knew who was going to be involved, who would take the lead in certain situations, whether it's, a polling place being threatened, a bomb threat, a cybersecurity, active shooter, sort of who's in charge, what the communication is going to be, and what are the main things we want to keep in mind. The county clerk and his task force came up with recently recommendations for voting equipment and training and the like. And so it's, as you know, with elections, it's multifaceted and it's sort of everything all at once, trying to do as much as you can and hoping that as a combination it works. The other piece of that, as we discussed briefly, is just the public information campaigns. And I think that there are a number of organizations in Wisconsin that have really stepped up. The League of Wisconsin Municipalities has produced several videos, public information videos. One of them recently was about the trip that your ballot takes from the voter to the voting machine, and really did a good job in a concise and understandable way of explaining to voters what happened with their ballot and what the security provisions are that are involved. You asked earlier about the difference between now and when I started. I think just the sense, obviously big changes like technology, voter registration systems being required, but just the sense that so many more actors are involved in the election space. Everybody from the Department of Homeland Security on down at the federal, state, and local level. It's become a bigger focus of our policymakers, our mayor, and our city council. And I just got an email this morning from our HR director asking city department heads to volunteer to serve as a chief election inspector for the November election. And we have a lot of great agencies from our engineering department to streets department that help out our clerk with the election. And it just was another signal that sort of the priority that the city is putting on effective and safe conduct of the election.
Right, I want to follow up on that last point you made. There were so many good points to unpack. I wish we had more than the half hour, but I'll go into the last point, which is this notion of enlisting the help of city department heads. I'm curious I couldn't tell if that was a new thing or if this was something that, is done on a habitual basis. But either way, I'm interested in what undergirds that, right? Whether it's, to your point about getting out accurate information, people that have some understanding about how government operates, the customer service piece, or frankly, maybe some of these folks are involved with these kinds of election security tabletop exercises that you were sort of walking through just a moment ago.
As you know, I only started a couple of years ago, and so it was in the 2020 election cycle. The mayor jokingly told me, a year later that she wished she could have predicted that the city would have needed an election attorney in the city attorney position. But even at that point, there was a lot of coordination. Now, as one example, just in our primary last week, for the first time, the Madison Police Department had a couple of officers stationed outside the city county building where the memory devices with the election results were being delivered on election night. That had never been done before. We have a Monona Terrace Convention Center, which has a lot of conferences and events, and some of their employees are stagehands. So we had stagehands, who did not have anything immediate to work on. They were helping to unload equipment, just taking care of some of the physical part of what's involved with elections. We have our engineering and our traffic engineering staff helping out with traffic situations, blocking off streets, of course, helping to set up polling places. So just a lot of different city agencies that are stepping up, and whatever the clerk needs, our mayor has sent a clear message that departments are supposed to help to the extent that we can.
You touched on a number of pieces on this, but I know, for example, that a month before the Wisconsin primary election, right, the Wisconsin Supreme Court, I think as I understand it, upheld a previous ruling, right, banning in most instances the use of drop boxes. For those election officials, how do you weave in the legal development piece into sort of the planning process? How did does Madison or maybe even other Wisconsin jurisdictions do that, right, on short notice? Because obviously, as you could attest to, best laid plans sometimes go out the window.
Yeah, it's, in preparation for this podcast, I was talking with our city clerk about lessons that we had learned from the primary. And the first thing that she said was, just the importance of resiliency. And for better or for worse, Wisconsin election officials have been under kind of the chronic need to just adjust to whether it's new legislation or litigation, court cases. I will just briefly tell you, when I was at the State Elections Commission, the night before the April 2020 presidential primary, Wisconsin was the only state to hold a primary in the midst of, the early pandemic. And we were sitting in a meeting of the Wisconsin Elections Commission the night before the election with cases before the Wisconsin Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court to determine whether there would even be an election the very next day. And I remember sitting in this closed session meeting of the commission and thinking, this is not the way to run a democracy, frankly. And that was the most extreme example, I think, of where litigation comes in. But, as you mentioned, we had a recent Supreme Court case. For our purposes, we had decided not to use drop boxes at our April election. It was debatable whether there was the circuit court decision in one county really affected us, but to be on the safe side, we did not use drop boxes. And drop boxes, as you mentioned, were not allowed for the August primary unless they were staffed. So again, communication, not only for our election officials, but to voters. We've had our drop boxes locked, and there's been a signage out there since early in the year that they're not to be used. But you don't want, voters who relied on them in 2020 to think, I'll be able to drop my ballot off the day before the election at the neighborhood drop box. So, we were used to, at the state, just gearing up whenever any new court decision would come out and getting out memos to clerks and information out to voters. So it's sort of the same drill at the local level, making sure, as you well know, the effort to try to have the public recognize local election officials as the expert on what the facts are has been going on now for a number of years. And it's even more important, I think, in Wisconsin, where we have really the most decentralized election administration system in the entire country. our elections are run by 1,850 municipal clerks. You imagine 2/3 of those are part-time, 400 to 500 turnover every year. To try to get elections to run consistently and properly, accurately, with that kind of system is a challenge. It can also be a strength when local voters know, my elections are being run by my neighbor and by my local poll workers.
I think about the amount of the legal changes, the threats, which you touched on, the task force dealing with, the ordinance being passed, and just the myriad of things that Wisconsin officials have to do. And of course, it's a very decentralized, very arguably the most decentralized process in the country. I'm curious what proactive steps, because you've touched on the communication piece, what proactive steps you and your Madison colleagues took to try and build these relationships with voters and other stakeholders to counter mis and disinformation ahead of the primary. I mean, just to give one example, the probe into the 2020 election, I understand just recently potentially concluded, but that probe by former Supreme Court Justice Gabon continued to go on even right through the primary. And so I'm curious from your perspective, what you and your colleagues were doing to try and proactively share that information and ensure that you had voter trust ahead of the primary.
I guess without editorializing or politicizing too much, I think with the Gableman investigation, I'll just briefly say, I think we knew from the start election processes are public, and we didn't expect anything to be learned from the investigation, and certainly nothing new was learned. It was unfortunate to see how the investigation was just used as a tool to spread more disinformation and create mistrust. Our clerk is very active in reaching out to the community, and a couple of examples come to mind. Our clerk did an equity analysis of the 2020 election and involved different community groups in providing feedback about how the elections are conducted. Are we missing anything in reaching out to groups, making sure that we have language access. And one of the big things that came out of it was identifying additional polling places and early voting sites that were in locations that were, frequented or near certain populations. Our Ho-Chunk Nation voters, we have a significant Hmong population. And so out of that whole discussion came a need or a desire to look at what, safe spaces, comfortable places, and convenient places could be located for polling places. We have, some very active voter advocacy groups, the League of Women Voters, Vote Riders. They're constantly in touch with the clerk's office with ideas. The other big thing that our office does, having a major university in our city, there's a Badger Vote Coalition that consists of our clerk's office and a bunch of university representation. They meet every Friday, actually, to think about how to message election messages to the student population, whether it's voter ID, voter registration, how to vote. We used to think at the state, well, here's our materials, university, you just send these out to the students. And they said, no, that's not how it works with students. We need to package this in a way that they will understand. So I think just engagement in general and in your local community, figuring out who the stakeholders are and how to proactively reach out to them and do it over the long term. Those relationships that were built previously, now when we have a situation like this court case, those relationships are already built. We have an avenue for getting the information out. That court decision left some holes. I mean, it was unclear what to do, how we were supposed to both comply with that court decision, which said only the voter could return their ballot, and federal laws like the ADA and the Voters' Rights Act. The case just did not address that. And so we had to try to quickly communicate how we in the city were going to accommodate individuals who needed assistance returning their ballot.
There's an awful lot to unpack there, but I appreciate, the challenge of that, and yes, no, the disconnect between the state and federal law is true, and of course, one of the other interesting parts of that Supreme Court decision was that the majority not only viewed that drop boxes were perhaps unconstitutional in spite of their previous success, but that their mere presence cast doubt on the legitimacy of the election process, which was, at least from where I sit, having worked with Republicans and Democrats, stunning. One of the things, I think is before I forget and I get off with you, I mean, you've touched on a number of threats in our conversation. You've touched on election worker threats. You've touched on disinformation. You've touched on sort of the evolution of election technology and the costs that are associated with making these kinds of upgrades. What do you think the biggest threat is to the integrity of U.S. elections, and why?
Well, I think it's probably no surprise to you and no surprise to your listeners. I've heard others on your podcast mention this threat we've been talking about disinformation. As I said, it's been really disheartening that we, as a nation, were so concerned about foreign interference, and a few short years later, we're looking at the major threat to elections and trust in elections is coming from not only domestic actors, but elected officials and candidates who frankly should know better. And, I used to sort of glibly just refer to all of that, all the conspiracy theories, as just the loser's lament. If you could not own up to the fact that you lost a fair and square election, you were inclined to just question the process. But we have to take those seriously. Everything, we've talked about. We had our 10 days before the primary, 10 days before every election, we have to publicly test our voting equipment. And that's publicly noticed. Anybody can attend. And this won't be a surprise to you, I know, but, I put on my own Twitter account, hey, the public test is coming up. If you have questions about voting equipment, you're welcome to come and ask questions. And we had 2 people show up for the public test. And that's would have been a great opportunity for people to get their questions answered, to see how things work. As others on your show have mentioned, once people are shown what happens and have a chance to ask questions, generally they're satisfied. That doesn't mean they'll always give up on their conspiracy theories, but at least they've made the attempt to learn. I think that's, at least in the environment we're in now and in the short term, that will continue to be the biggest challenge to our election officials. And then, personally speaking on their behalf, it's what comes out of that, which we've talked about, kind of the threats and harassment and personal toll it takes on good election officials who are, just stories over the weekend about entire election staff resigning. I don't remember if that was in Texas or Georgia, but it's gotten to be a serious issue for us.
No, I appreciate you raising that. That was a Texas jurisdiction for which we saw that, and unfortunately, it's certainly not an isolated case, part of a sort of broader nationwide challenge. Mike, thank you, for coming on Ballots and Bagels to discuss the Wisconsin primary. Being, I think, very sort of blunt in noting the challenges, but also talking about some of what Madison is trying to do and others are trying to do to deal with these things. And good luck with your future elections. I'd like to thank Rachel Dean Wilson, Kayla Goodson, Krisha Sikora, and Hannah Foreman for making this interview possible, as well as Abby Foreman for her branding work. Ballots and Bagels, Conversations with Trusted Sources is a production of the Alliance for Securing Democracy. Thanks for listening in, and until next time, keep the faith in U.S. elections.